News of the times. A most inconvenient pregnancy, class, murder, and the Doddinghurst tragedy of 1850. Welcome to News of the Times. It was a quiet corner of Essex, the village of Doddinghurst, where, in the autumn of 1850, the body of a young woman was found lying in a meadow. She was just 20. Her name was Jael, and she was within days of giving birth. The man accused of her murder was everything society admired. A yeoman's son, respectable, engaged to marry with prospects and polish, but appearances, as ever, can be deceptive. In this episode, we look beyond the crime itself to the world that shaped it, a world where reputation was currency, class meant protection, and an inconvenient pregnancy could spell ruin. This is not simply a tale of murder. It is a story of Victorian respectability, cold calculation, and the quiet brutality of the double standard. And in today's end of episodes, further particulars, in a London workshop in 1875, a moment of rodent-related chaos turns tragically surreal when a young man attempted to impress a room full of startled girls, only to end up swallowing the very mouse he'd caught. What followed was quite literally hard to digest. So, settle in with something warming at the ready, turn the lights down low, and let the sounds of the present slip away. We're travelling back to Victorian England, a time of gaslight and gossip, of rigid rules and private ruin. This is News of the Times. Class standards in 1850s England, a rural divide. In 1850s England, class wasn't just a question of money. It defined every aspect of a person's life, how they dressed, who they spoke to, where they sat in church, and most importantly, who they were allowed to marry. In rural communities like Doddinghurst, the lines between classes were stark. At the top sat the landed gentry and yeomanry, men who owned land or managed estates, often serving in local militia or on committees. Beneath them were tradesmen, farm labourers, domestic servants, and those whose lives were measured in daily wages rather than inherited acres. Respectability mattered. A man from the yeomanry was expected to marry a woman of his own station, someone with refinement, family reputation, and preferably a dowry. A dalliance with a servant girl or farmer's daughter might be tolerated as long as it remained discreet, but pregnancy, that was a scandal that could ruin futures. For women of the lower classes, the consequence was often devastating. Without protection, legal or social, they were blamed, shamed, and discarded. A pregnancy out of wedlock could mean dismissal from employment, social ostracism, and destitution. Worse still, as in the case of Jael, it could cost a young woman her life. Child maintenance in 1850s England. In 1850s England, the responsibility for supporting illegitimate children, often referred to in harsh legal terms as bastards, was not a matter left to chance. Under the Bastardy laws, the mother was expected to name the father, and once identified, he could be legally compelled to pay maintenance for the child's upbringing. This was not a moral obligation, but a practical and legal one. If the father refused or disappeared, the financial burden would fall not on the family, but on the local parish under the poor law system. For rural communities like Doddinghurst, this was no small matter. Parishes were vigilant in pursuing the putative father, as they were legally entitled to recoup costs through the courts. The result? A young man could face decades of enforced payments and social shame if declared the father, particularly scandalous for someone of a higher social class, such as a member of the local yeomanry. In some tragic cases, this fear of lifelong financial and reputational ruin drove men to desperate and sometimes murderous decisions. The village. In the 1850s, Doddinghurst was a small, close-knit Essex farming village surrounded by open fields, hedgerows and wooded lanes. Life moved at the pace of the agricultural calendar, and the population was largely made up of labourers, tenanted farmers and local yeomanry, men of property but not of the gentry, all of which made the discovery on a quiet October morning in 1850 all the more shocking and all the more scandalous. From the Chelmsford Chronicle, the 18th of October 1850, shocking murder of a female at Doddinghurst. The inhabitants of the village of Doddinghurst in this county and the neighbourhood were thrown into a state of painful excitement on Sunday last, a report being circulated that a young single woman named Jael had been found lifeless and that her death had been wilfully occasioned. Vast numbers consequently flocked to the scene of the alleged murder, and from the facts detailed below, there would appear to be too much truth in the rumour. The stepfather of the young woman named last lived in a farm held off-hand called the Brick House Farm near Canterbury, Tye, in the parish of Shenfield. The father was bailiff to Mr. Drury, who formerly resided here but is now living at Little Burstead. A son of Mr. Drury, about 20 years of age, lived in the Brick House Farm as his father's representative, and, it is stated, was upon the most intimate terms with the unfortunate Jael, who occasionally frequented the house. The deceased was a remarkably fine young woman of about the same age, but some assert an impression unfavourable to her character prevailed, and at the time of her death she was within a few days of her confinement, although we are assured from another quarter that her character would bear the strictest scrutiny, and except in the matter connected with this unfortunate affair, her conduct had been unexceptionable. The parents of Drury are persons, we are informed, of irreproachable character, highly respected by everyone, and their unfortunate identification with the occurrence in question, even as a matter of suspicion with regard to their son, has excited for them the greatest sympathy in the neighbourhood. The father of Drury has been greatly averse to his son's intimacy with Jael. Last, and Jael's mother at Michaelmas removed into a small farmhouse called Comber's Farm, adjoining about 2 fields distant from the other house. The acquaintance was still continued by Drury, and on Friday last an appointment was made by her to meet him near a stile about 20 rods from the house. At 6 in the evening, this appointment, however, he did not keep. She saw Drury on Saturday afternoon and told her mother she was again to meet him at 5:30. She returned home, took some tea, but before she had finished, left, saying she was then going and would finish when she returned. Her mother told her to put on her mother's old cloak, a blue one, and a bonnet, as it was cold, which she did, and advised her to put her handkerchief round to keep the cold out of her mouth. She was lately having had the toothache. Jael quitted the house, as the sequence will show, never to return. Her father and mother did not go to bed till nearly 10 o'clock, and previously tied the key of the door in a white cloth, suspending it from the window that she might let herself into the house when she came back. They became naturally alarmed that she did not return, and in the morning the old man rose at an early hour, fearing some harm had befallen her, and went out in search of her. After exploring the neighbourhood for a mile or two around, following the course of a brook running through the farm, suspecting she had been drowned, he retraced his steps when he, in a nook of the bottom of a meadow adjoining that next to the house, he saw the object of his search lying on her face. A cord with a slip noose was wound tightly round her throat 3 times, the end of it being placed loosely in her left hand, which was clenched and bent up. It was a small box cord about 3 yards long and an open noose at the end, and having been drawn so tightly as to cut into the flesh, was then twisted 3 times round. It would have been next to an impossibility, it is thought, by those who had seen it, for anyone to have pulled the cord so tightly other than by kneeling upon the person for the purpose. Life was quite extinct when the body was found, but it was clearly perfectly cold only at the extremities. There was a considerable effusion of blood, and from the general appearances it is supposed that she could not have struggled much. Drury the younger is charged on suspicion of having caused her death. He was apprehended by the police and now remains in custody at the Brentwood police station, awaiting the results of the inquest. At first, the very idea that the Drury family, pillars of local respectability, could be touched by scandal was met with disbelief. As yeoman farmers, well regarded and well connected, they occupied a higher rung in the social order. That their son might be involved in something so sordid drew both shock and sympathy, especially from those keen to protect the family's reputation. Jael Denny, meanwhile, was not only 9 months pregnant, but in some corners quietly maligned. Suggestions of a loose character were circulated, as if to soften the edges of what had occurred. Yet neighbours who knew her best insisted this was unjust, that she had been a decent girl, deceived and discarded. Either way, the matter could no longer be contained. With the young woman dead and the community reeling, the authorities convened an inquest, and the search for answers began. The inquest. Yesterday the inquest was held on the body, and a jury composed principally of farmers collected from the neighbourhood, who assembled at the house of Mr. Cumbers, adjacent to which the body was lying at her parents' residence, and after viewing it and also the spot where it was found, at which a large quantity of blood where she had lain was visible, the proceedings were adjourned to the farmhouse of Mr. Hammond, and the examination of the witnesses was proceeded with. At the inquest, Jael's mother, Louisa Last, described her daughter's final evening with poignant detail. Jael had gone out earlier that afternoon to see Thomas Drury and returned in good spirits, telling her mother that he had walked with her through the meadow and had arranged to meet her again that evening at 6:30. They sat down to tea with her stepfather, but Jael barely touched hers. She drank 1 cup and set her bread and butter aside, saying she would finish it when she got back. She was cheerful, even excited, and told her mother she wouldn't be long. The meeting was only to take place at the first stile in the meadow. She never came back. Her parents stayed up until nearly 11, growing increasingly anxious. When there was still no sign of her the next morning, her stepfather rose early to search and made the grim discovery just fields away. Jael's mother continued. In the morning I went out after a little after 5. I searched the river all the way down because I was afraid that he had done something to her, meaning Thomas Drury. I didn't find her. While I was looking one way, my husband was looking another. At nearly 9 o'clock I returned and found the dead body at home. She was dead, but not cold. Her body was warm, but her face and hands were very cold. Her face was much discoloured, more than it is now. It was black and scarlet. The eyes were closed and swelled, and her tongue was out further, and I believe fixed between her teeth. The bonnet was not bent in this way when she went out, nor was the cloak torn. I knew my daughter was pregnant, and she told me she expected to go but a fortnight longer. My husband and I lived at an off-hand farm of Mr. Drury's, the father, 2 years and 4 months, and left the day before last Michaelmas Day. Thomas Drury lived there with us. On the 28th of September I went to the house where I now live, and since then my daughter has lived with me. To my knowledge, an intimacy took place between the deceased and Mr. Drury's son. I spoke to him about it and blamed him for encouraging her to come. After I knew she was pregnant, I mentioned it the same day, the 3rd of September. I said to him, "Thomas, you must be a villain. I hear you are going to be married to Miss Gibbling, and my daughter is 7 months gone in the family way by you." He said nothing. I mentioned it to him several times after that. He always denied it. He said it was none of his, and he knew nothing about it. As the inquest unfolded, it became clear that Thomas Drury had not only distanced himself from Jael in public, but had made several efforts to do so in writing as well. Weeks before her death, Drury had insisted that Jael sign a letter he had dictated, one that denied he was the father of her unborn child. The scene as described by Jael's mother was as bizarre as it was telling. Drury was found hiding under her bed, paper in hand, presuming the younger woman to sign what would later appear a desperate attempt to absolve himself of responsibility and preserve his standing with the woman he was actually engaged to marry. The victim's mother continued. On the last Michaelmas Day we had been taking away fruit trees from the other house, and Thomas Drury and his brother Benjamin had been in the garden. I missed Thomas and did not know where he went. When I went home to our present house, I found my daughter, who I had left to cook the dinner, very hot and trembling. I asked her what made her so, and on going upstairs I found Thomas Drury under my bed. He got up and said, "Will you sign this?" handing me this paper, open. I said, "I know nothing about it. I will not set my hand to any paper. What do you do here?" I went down and said to her, "What a fool you! You must be a fool to flurry yourself and write a pack of nonsense just to please him." She said nothing, and I went out. I think this paper is all her handwriting. When I went back, she said Thomas had been there and said that she had set it about that the child she was pregnant with was his. He had been told of it, at the agricultural meeting, and if she had any love for him, she would give him a note to say it was not to show to Miss Giblin, and he would show it to no one else. The letter, September the 29th, 1850. This is to prove that this trouble that I am in is not by Thomas Drury, although I suppose that it had been reported that it is, and therefore I write to supply the mind of those who may read this note that I wish them to trouble themselves with their own business. Jael Denny. She said he told her what to write. On Saturday morning, as she was sitting at work, she said she would go to see if she could see Thomas Drury, and if she could not, she would go down to the house, for she was determined to see him once more, for she expected her confinement and could not then go out. She had made things for her confinement and prepared a change of everything. She told me that Thomas had given her some poison, and she took some of it. She knew it was poison because her flesh swelled, and if she had taken it all, it would have killed her. I noticed that her lips and nose were swelled, and when I noticed it, she told me of the poison and said, "He's a naughty boy." She said she put the remainder of the poison into the fire. She was ill all the time and somewhat frantic. She appeared very faint, could not eat, and her breath smelt very much. I said I wondered should they let him have poison. If the mother's account painted a picture of coercion, evasion, and deliberate manipulation, what followed was even more devastating. Now it was the turn of Jael's stepfather, the man who had gone out at dawn hoping to find his daughter safe. Instead, what he found that morning would shatter the household, the village, and any remaining doubt that something terrible had taken place. Thomas last examined. On Sunday morning I went in search of her about 6 o'clock. I came down the mead and searched that, and after searching various places, I found her in Mr. Cumber's mead at the spot pointed out to the jury. That is 2 fields from the stile where she said she was to meet Thomas Drury. She was lying flat on her face, her right hand under her, and her left bent upwards. She had her bonnet on as she left home. I touched her and observed a cord around her neck. One end of the cord was loose in her left hand and loose over her cloak. I went home and sent for the constable, and Mr. Hammond came to me. We went together to the body, and we turned her over. Her face was swollen and black. The bonnet and shawl were in the same state now that they were then. The cord was 3 times round her neck, and apparently very tight. There was blood on her mouth and nose and eyes. There was also blood on the ground. Information was given to the police at Brentford, and she was removed to my house. William Hammond deposed. I knew the deceased. I was called to her yesterday morning. I saw the father coming from the place where she lay. I heard him moaning and ran to ask what was the matter. I think it was a little after 8. I went to the spot and found the deceased lying on her belly, leaning to one side quite straight, and her clothes down and orderly. About 3 yards off lay a fur tippet. I assisted to turn her over, when I saw the cord around her neck 3 times and one end around her left hand. I looked at the end of the rope and I said, "This is square and has been recently cut." To all appearance it had. Her face was discoloured and the blood lay about a foot from and up to her face. There was blood oozing from her mouth and nose, and I think from her eyes and from her ears. I examined the cord to see how it was tied, and I found the bight of the noose towards the back of the neck and the knot of it in front. A small part of the apron of the bonnet and of the cloak were inside the cord, between that and the neck. The first turn of the cord was not very tight. The others were excessively tight. When I felt the deceased's neck, it was still a little warm, but the extremities were cold, and my opinion is that she had been dead 6 or 7 hours. The harrowing discovery of Jael's body, with its unmistakable signs of violence, left little doubt this was no accident, nor any act of self-harm. As word spread and neighbours gathered in horrified silence, the authorities were swiftly summoned, and it was now the turn of the Essex Constabulary to take charge. What followed was a methodical and unsettling chain of investigation, beginning with the quiet arrival of Superintendent Coulson, who sought out the man everybody now had reason to question, Thomas Drury. Thomas Coulson, Superintendent of Essex Police, deposed, "From the information received, I went to the place. On my way there, I called at the house of Robert Moore at Shenfield and saw Thomas Drury there. I asked him if he knew the deceased and when he saw her last, and he said at 5:30 last night. I asked if he had heard anything about her this morning. He said no. I said I had received information that she was murdered, and it was highly necessary for him to accompany me to the spot where she was lying. He got into my cart and came to Mr. Hammond's house and walked down. When we entered the second mead, he slackened his pace and could scarcely move on, and I said, 'Step out.' He did not answer. I went to the spot and found the deceased. He stood a little way off, and he appeared to shrink back. The victim's nose was flattened on the left side, which appeared to have had much pressure, and there was a bubbling of blood from the mouth. The cord was embedded into the neck. It was removed in my presence. The noose of the cord had cut the skin of the neck, and the first and second turn were so tight that the neck was swelling above it. The left arm was stiff. I told him I should consider it my duty to take him into custody and take him before a magistrate. He did not speak. I took him to the last's house and searched him and found money, keys, etc. on him. He said he had a letter in his box that would show the child was not his. We went to Mr. Drury's house and opened his box, and in the locker was the letter that had been read. I also found in the locker of the box, locked up, the 2 pieces of cord I produced, and I observed that one end of one piece had been recently cut, which exactly corresponds with that around the neck, except that the round the neck is darker as it would be. There are also some parts of the cord rougher than others, but where they are cut, they are both alike. On the way to Mr. Hammond's, Drury said he had formerly been acquainted with the deceased, but had broken it off more than 9 months ago. There were some marks on his breeches that I considered blood, but he said it was doing by something used for the calves. The breeches with the spots were produced. He said he would let me see the stuff when he got to the farm. There he produced this pot, but he said he had not used it for a long time. The prisoner, when at his father's house, said her mother had asked him whether his razors were all right, meaning if he had missed any of them. He said he would go and see, and he found that they were where they were, and asked her what she had meant, and she said she had heard her daughter say she would destroy herself. Louise Last, mother of the deceased, was recalled, and she denied that she had ever had any conversation with the prisoner about his razors. Never told him she had heard her daughter say she would destroy herself, and she never heard her say so, and never mentioned the subject to him. The final sighting of Jael alive came from a worker named John Harris, who observed her and Thomas Drury meeting at a stile at about 5:30 on Saturday evening, consistent with her mother's account. Harris recalled that Jael seemed in good spirits and told him she was to meet Drury again later that night. Crucially, Harris also testified that several months earlier, Drury had expressed unease about the relationship. In his words, "I wish to shut her off. I think I shall carry on so far that it will bring me into trouble." The post-mortem evidence came from Mr. William, surgeon, who described the injuries in grim detail. There were deep lacerations around the neck, as though two cords had been drawn tightly across it, and faint marks on the arm, as if from a bite. Inside, the signs were unmistakable. The lungs were dark and congested, the windpipe compressed on three sides, the tongue and jaw twisted, all clear indications of violent strangulation. Jael had been 9 months pregnant with a male child. The surgeon was certain the baby had been alive moments before her death. When asked whether such injuries could have been self-inflicted, he was emphatic. Certainly not. If she had attempted to strangle herself, she would have been rendered insensible before she could have caused so much violence as was seen on her neck. My opinion is that the injuries in the chest were produced by a person kneeling upon her just before death. The inquest resumed the following day, and with it the entire village watched as a test of class, justice and consequence unfolded. In every cottage, parlour and public house across Doddinghurst and beyond, speculation ran rife. The shock of the murder was compounded by the social implications. A respectable yeoman's son suspected of killing a girl from a humbler background, a girl pregnant with a child he insisted was not his. Lines were quietly drawn among the labouring families. There was sympathy for Jael, a young woman deceived and discarded. Amongst those of higher standing, concern turned inward for the Drury family reputation, for the scandal that now shadowed their name. It was no longer just a question of guilt, but who had the right to be believed. And so, with every seat filled and every eye watchful, the inquest pressed on. From the Sun, the 18th of October, 1850, the Doddinghurst murder. Yesterday at 2 o'clock, the adjourned inquest on the death of Jael Denny was resumed at the police station in Brentwood before Mr. C. Lewis, the coroner. The extraordinary interest which the proceedings have excited was manifested by a densely crowded courtroom, but every precaution had been taken to provide for the accommodation of those obliged to be present on business. Mr. Hawkins of the Home Circuit attended as counsel for the accused, and Mr. Woodward as his solicitor. His father, his uncle, and other relatives were also in court, and, judging of them by their appearance, seemed to be very respectable people. A sister of the deceased girl and several other women were in attendance, and the former, at one point in the proceedings, sobbed aloud and became hysterical. With this exception, the inquiry was conducted in the midst of the most profound silence and without any disturbing incident or any strong emotion being displayed. When Drury came in, he shook hands with his father and uncle, but appeared far less agitated by the interview than either of them. His perfect self-possession throughout formed a remarkable contrast to his almost feminine cast of countenance. He is a little man, and under ordinary circumstances, notwithstanding a smart, active figure, could hardly have had sufficient strength to overpower the murdered girl Denny, who was 5 feet 9 inches in height and a powerful, well-proportioned and rather comely girl. The coroner summed up the evidence. It was quite clear, and had been admitted by all sides, that there must have been an intimacy existing between Thomas Drury and the deceased. It was clear also that she was within days of her confinement, and that for some time he had supposed that she could father the child upon him. They were seen together between 4 and 5 o'clock on Saturday evening, after which she went home and mentioned to her mother that she had an appointment again with him at 6:30. According to the statement of Hubbard, he left his house at that hour also, and it was for the jury to say whether he then went and met her at the stile. It would occupy him, the prisoner, Thomas Drury, 7 or 8 minutes walk from the place of meeting to where the body was found. The jury could remember that the deceased wore a shawl and a cloak, and she was nearly 9 months advanced on pregnancy, and that it was impossible to suppose that she could make much resistance, and if any man wished to strangle her, not more than 7 or 8 minutes would be required to do so. This would bring the time to 7 o'clock, and it appeared that the prisoner was seen at Brentwood about 10 minutes past 8, for which there was ample time. When first taken into custody, Drury referred to the letter which had been produced in evidence and which he said would clear him. That showed that the woman and child were then bearing on his mind, and that they found him saying that he had been acquainted with her but had broken it off 9 months ago. This statement had been proved false by several witnesses. The prisoner had never broken off the acquaintance. He had been in the habit of seeing the deceased since last April 2 or 3 times a week, and since then frequently. Then, with regard to the stains of blood on his clothes, when taken into custody, he told Superintendent Coulson that these had been caused by some stuff which he had been giving to the calves, and in support of this an old pot was produced by him covered with cobwebs, and the state of which proved that nothing had been taken from it for some time. The falsehood of this statement was also established by the evidence of Professor Tyler, a gentleman whose testimony was entitled to the greatest weight, who gave it as his opinion that the stains were caused by blood. An inference might be drawn with them that the accused wished it to be supposed that the girl had committed suicide, but the perpetrator of this horrible crime, whomever he might be, had used too much violence, more than was necessary for his purpose, and in fact so much so as to convince them that it was no act of the deceased herself, but must have been done by another person. The jury would therefore form in their own minds an opinion as to what the intention was which led to these representations. He had drawn their attention to all the facts which he thought of importance in this terrible case. If they were dissatisfied with the evidence implying guilt in any particular person, they would return a verdict of murder against some person or persons unknown. If, however, on the other hand, they thought the evidence sufficiently brought home guilt to Thomas Drury, then they would find a verdict accordingly. The jury then retired and the prisoner was withdrawn at the same time. After the lapse of about a quarter of an hour, they returned into court and amid solemn silence, the foreman announced as their unanimous verdict that Thomas Drury was guilty of the wilful murder of Jael Denny. With the inquest concluded and the jury's verdict clear, public interest in the case only deepened. The charge now formalised, Thomas Drury would stand trial for the wilful murder of Jael Denny. And so, as the trial opened in Chelmsford before a rapt and divided audience, the questions before the court were no longer simply of evidence, but of motive, morality, and the dangerous weight of Victorian respectability. The evidence which had been so ably presented at the inquest was laid out again, with over 30 witnesses called. Throughout the proceedings, Drury maintained his innocence. His defence argued that Jael, overcome with distress, had taken her own life, or failing that, suggested that she had been a woman of loose virtue and could have met her end at the hands of any number of unnamed men. The prosecution offered a different view. They contended that Drury, engaged to marry a woman of his own class, saw Jael's pregnancy not only as a personal inconvenience, but as financial and social catastrophe. A scandal that could destroy his future. A child born out of wedlock meant not only disgrace, but lifelong burdens of parish-enforced maintenance payments. Better then, so the prosecution argued, that Jael and her unborn child be removed altogether. And so, with the arguments made, the evidence weighed, the court waited its final verdict. From the Chelmsford Chronicle, the 14th of March, 1851, the summing up and verdict. Lord Campbell then proceeded to sum up the evidence. His lordship said, "Upon you devolves the solemn task of deciding whether Thomas Drury is guilty of the crime laid to this charge. It has been truly said, his fate is in your hands." On the part of the prosecution, it is alleged that this young man, having formed an illicit connection with the unfortunate girl Jael Denny, and she being with child by him, had formed the determination of making away with her in such a manner that it should be suspected and believed that she died by her own hand, and that he might escape with impunity. They allege that in the execution of that wicked design he formed an engagement with her at 6:30 on the evening of the 12th of October, and that, having met her, he perfected that design. On the other side, it is stated that she committed suicide. At all events, if murdered, there is no sufficient evidence to bring home that act to the prisoner at the bar. Now, you have first to consider whether Jael Denny was murdered, and secondly, if she was, whether the evidence satisfactorily proves to you that Thomas Drury was the murderer. You are not to act on mere suspicion or probability, but you must morally be convinced of his guilt before you find a verdict of guilty. If there is reasonable doubt, you will give the prisoner the benefit of it and say he is not guilty. The jury retired for 30 minutes and returned with a verdict of guilty. The verdict sent a ripple of astonishment through the courtroom that a young man of Thomas Drury's standing, a yeoman's son, well connected, with family presentable enough to sit amongst the gentry, should be found guilty of murder was, to many, unthinkable. It had seemed impossible to some that the weight of a farming girl's death might tip the scales of justice against a man of property and prospects, but the evidence proved overwhelming, and the jury returned their verdict without hesitation. Outside the courtroom, public feeling ran high. It was said that scarcely a criminal trial in the county had ever stirred such interest. Crowds gathered on both days, eager for a glimpse of the accused. When the verdict was announced, cheers and jeers broke out. Attempts were made to smuggle Drury away quietly, but the mob caught wind of it, surrounded the prison van with yells and hoots. So fierce was the anger, and perhaps the catharsis of seeing privilege finally held to account, that after the trial's close, fears of personal violence prompted a second decoy. Drury was hurried from the court in a hired fly, again met with shouts and curses as it drove away. A confession did not take long to follow. Within days of the trial's end, the shock of conviction and perhaps the weight of his conscience bore down. Thomas Drury confessed he now admitted, murdered Jael Denny. His reason: she had become, in his words, an encumbrance, a barrier to the life he had planned, a problem to be removed. The case had gripped not only the quiet lanes of Doddinghurst, but the nation. In a country where class so often dictated outcome, the conviction and confession of Thomas Drury stood as a rare and deeply public reckoning. From the Weekly Times and Echo, London, 16th of March, 1851. The hope which bore up Drury through the trial for the delivery of the verdict he seemed to have been confident of escape forsook him on reaching the jail after his condemnation. He was so exhausted that he was obliged to be assisted to his cell by two of the officials, and on reaching it he flung himself to his bed and lay sobbing violently for an hour. The confession of Drury. The slightest shadow of doubt which might have lingered in the public mind has been removed by Drury's full and thorough admission of his guilt to the chaplain and the governor. The following is the substance of his statement. He admits that his hand committed the murder, adding that he believed throughout that because the deed was shrouded in darkness and its perpetrator concealed from every human eye, it would be impossible for justice to reach him. He says that he had for some time meditated on the crime and carried the rope about with him for the purpose. That he accomplished the deed by stepping behind her as they were walking and slipping the rope around her neck, adding also that the mark on her wrist was not produced by his teeth but by his fingernails. In the early part of the week it was his intention to have committed his confession to paper, but this idea had been abandoned. The magistrate considered that his unqualified admission to amply sufficient to satisfy justice and the public, and that his fresh recital of the circumstances connected with the fearful crime could answer no moral or useful purpose. They therefore thought it might that he should not be pressed for the minute details. Drury shows to what depths of horror the first steps from virtue leads. Probably he at one period loved his victim with the purity of affection, that she clung to him with all the intensity of a woman's love. The sacrifices she had made and the letter she gave him to calm his mind incontestably shows. Yet that very love has led to the most startling and revolting crimes, and to ignominy and death. What a lesson is here printed in characters of blood. From the John Bull, the 29th of March, 1851. The execution of Thomas Drury. The sentence of the law was carried into effect on Tuesday morning over the entrance of the county jail at Springfield, the confines of the borough of Chelmsford. It is satisfactory to state, as regards Drury, that notwithstanding the provoking statements he made after conviction and the imputations he cast upon his victim, Monday evening at the 11th hour he penned a document and subscribed it with his name, in which he admitted the enormity of his crime and his hope that his victim was at rest in heaven, described the murder as a malicious and barbarous act, and prayed God that the forfeiture of his life might deter others from committing so wicked and horrible an atrocity. On Monday evening, Drury wrote a petition to the sheriff expressing a wish that the money, amounting to about £8, found upon his person when apprehended, should be handed to the mother of his unfortunate victim as some restitution for the grievous injury he had done her. It was too late for Jael Denny and too late for mercy, but with the gallows behind him and the rope in sight, Thomas Drury finally called it what it was, a malicious and barbarous act. 1 life stolen, 2 lives lost, and a community left to reckon with what justice truly means. Further particulars. And now, from one tale of fatal consequence to another. But where the murder of poor Jael Denny revealed the cold calculations of class and reputation in 1850s England, our next case, from of a quarter of a century later, features no romance, no betrayal, and no poison cord. Just one man, one mouse, and an inquest that left the coroner and likely the coroner's lunch unsettled for days. From the pages of the Manchester Evening News, we bring you a story quite literally swallowed whole. From the Manchester Evening News, the 31st of December, 1875. Killed by a mouse. Extraordinary occurrence. An extraordinary occurrence has been brought to light at an inquest held on the body of a man in South London. It appears that in a workroom where many young girls were at work, a mouse suddenly made its appearance off the table, causing, of course, considerable commotion and a general stampede. The intruder was seized, however, by a young man who happened to be present, but the mouse slipped out of his hand and, running up his sleeve, came out between his waistcoat and shirt at the neck. The unfortunate man had his mouth open, and the mouse, on the lookout for some convenient place of concealment, entered the man's mouth, and he, in his fright and surprise, swallowed it. That a mouse can exist for a considerable time without much air has been a popular belief, and was unfortunately proved fact in the present instance, for the mouse began to tear and bite inside the man's throat and chest, and the result was that the unfortunate fellow died after a little time in horrible agony. Several witnesses have corroborated the above facts, and medical testimony as to the cause of death having been given, a verdict of accidental death was returned. And so ends another chapter in the long and ignoble tradition of rural wickedness. As Miss Marple might say, there's far more evil in the hedgerows than on the high street. If you've enjoyed this episode, do consider tapping anything that looks vaguely encouraging, a like, a thumbs up, or hopefully glance towards the screen. There may well be more buttons than we yet understand. Show the YouTube algorithm, a slippery customer at the best of times, that News of the Times is deserving of pride of place in any respectable parlour. And if you're one of those fine souls who believes more is more, then do consider joining us on Patreon for the full immersive experience of crime, scandal, and a generous pour of British humour. You'll find over 750 ad-free episodes, daily drops, and a full immersion into the world of Victorian and Edwardian crime and history. All for the price of an indifferent cappuccino, and we dare say far more satisfying. That's £5 a month. No fuss, cancel any time. We'd rather think you'll stay for the company. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, Assistant Under Clerk to the Board of Unreasonable Happenings. Would the last person out please oil the squeaky hamster wheel? It's terribly distracting during the autopsies. Until next time.